Welcome, everybody. I hope you're having a great Independence Day weekend, and I'm so glad that you've carved out the time to be here today, whether you're joining us online or joining us in person at one of our locations. And you picked a great time to join us because today we're beginning a brand new teaching series. It's called When God Doesn't Make Sense. Oh, and by the way, if you are attending in person, you know that there are some exciting changes taking place around our buildings. I've been able to walk through two of our buildings over this past week, and it's been amazing to see all the work that's already done. We've had contractors in here working long hours, installing new signs, painting walls, setting up furniture. And as we move out of the COVID era and start to get back to normal, it is so exciting to be able to welcome people into facilities that feel so fresh and so inviting. And you're going to continue to see other changes around our buildings over the next couple of months. But as I've been saying, one thing that's not changing and won't change is that we will still be a church that's for Northeastern Pennsylvania. And again, if you have any questions as we move through this process, I'd love to answer them. Don't hesitate to ask anything. Just send me an email to this address, merger@parkerhill.org. Now, the best thing you can do to get acquainted with our new church family is to attend two LCBC classes called First Steps and Growth Track. Normally, these two classes are offered one class per week over 4 weeks, second one broken up into 3 weeks, but we've bundled them together in one 3-hour time slot for all Parker Hill attenders. And so your next opportunity to attend these classes is just a couple of weeks away, Sunday, July 18th at 3 o'clock. And this next class will be held at the Wilkes-Barre campus. And in the 3 hours we spend together there, we'll just get a deeper understanding of this larger church family that we're joining and have the chance to reconnect with other Parker Hill attenders from across all three of our locations here in the Northeast. So to sign up, just go to parkerhill.org/LCBC. So sign up for that today. We'll see you there in a couple of weeks. And bottom line is this: I am honestly so excited about our future together as we continue to shine the light of the gospel here in Northeastern Pennsylvania. Great things are yet to come. Well, today, as I mentioned, we're beginning a brand new 4-week teaching series across all 18 locations of LCBC Church. It's called When God Makes No Sense. And if we're honest, all of us would have to admit that there are times in life when God's actions or his inaction make no sense to us. There are times in life when we wonder if God is even there. This past week, as I was thinking about this message, I remembered a movie that came out about 18 years ago called Bruce Almighty. And in the movie, Jim Carrey plays a guy named Bruce Nolan. And he's angry because everything in his life seems to be falling apart, and he starts blaming God for the way his life is turning out. So after a while, God, played by Morgan Freeman, gets tired of hearing all the complaints, and he pays a visit to Bruce Nolan. In the movie, the way that God tried to get Bruce's attention was by paging him. And if you don't know what a pager is, ask your parents. So Bruce's pager would go off, and there would be a phone number on it that he had never seen before. That was how God was trying to get in touch with him. Now, almost every time a phone number appears in any movie, it's a fake phone number, right? And usually it begins with 3 numbers, 555. But the producers of this movie just picked a random phone number. It was 776-2323, which happened to be a real phone number in quite a few different area codes. In fact, 30 people across the country had the very phone number that was used in that movie. And so thousands of people began calling this number that they had seen on the pager on the movie screen. I don't know why. Maybe just out of curiosity, maybe they thought God actually had a phone number and it was just unlisted all that time. I don't know the reason, but thousands of people just started calling that number. One woman left a message on an answering machine in Colorado, and her message said this: God, I'm in jail right now. Like I said to you last night, I love you. Another caller said, hey, God, I've done some really bad things in my life and I need to repent, so please answer my prayers. Someone else in a different area code called the number and said, I know this isn't the real number for God, but I'm calling to see if you have the number. And when I first heard that whole story after the movie had come out, it just reminded me that there is this universal longing in every human heart to know that God is there, right? We all want to connect with him. And yet many of us would admit that there are times in life when it feels like God is so distant, like you're dialing the number, but nobody is answering. There are times when it seems like God has forgotten about you, when life makes no sense and God makes no sense. And let me tell you, if you've ever felt that way, you're not alone. Let me tell you about a time when I felt like God's actions made no sense. I had a younger sister who died of cancer at the age of 45, my sister Lisa. She was a single mom, and she owned a small business. And one day her dentist found what they thought was just an abscessed tooth, just a gum infection. Eventually they realized it was a very rare form of melanoma called mucosal melanoma. And by the time they diagnosed it, it was already a stage 4 cancer. She fought it for 10 months, but then ultimately lost the battle and passed away, as I said, at the age of 45. And you know, during those 10 months, I prayed for my sister all the time. Like I dialed God's number, but he didn't seem to answer. And as the months went by and as her condition got worse, she got to the point where she couldn't live alone. And so one of my older sisters moved in with her, and the rest of us would take turns being there when my older sister needed a break. And a few months before she died, I remember I took a week off and went down to Charlotte to stay with Lisa. And I remember one afternoon I was driving her home from a radiation appointment, and she started feeling sick to her stomach, and she began to throw up. And the only thing I had in my car was a plastic grocery bag, and she just kept apologizing because some of it missed the bag and ended up on my car seat. It was a really rough day. And when I got her home and got her settled in, I went out on her back porch, and I remember just having an honest conversation with God and saying, God, do you see what is happening here? And do you care? I've given my life to you. I'm a pastor. Doesn't that count for something? I mean, have you ever felt that way? If you haven't, there's a very good chance that you will at some point, and there's a very good chance that you know someone who's feeling that way right now. There will come a point where you find yourself in circumstances where God's actions or his inaction seem to make no sense. What do you do? What do you do when God makes no sense? And so we're going to wrestle with that question over these next 4 weeks, and we're going to be learning together from a book of the Bible called Habakkuk. Everyone say the name of this book with me so we get it right. Okay, 1, 2, 3, here we go. Habakkuk. Yeah, if you say it correctly, it sounds like you just coughed up a fur ball, okay? So Habakkuk is a small book of the Bible tucked away in the Old Testament. Habakkuk was a minor prophet, but it has a very powerful message for us today. Habakkuk, as I said, was an Old Testament prophet. He lived and wrote about 600 years before the birth of Christ. But he was a very different kind of prophet, because what prophets normally do is they speak to the people on behalf of God. That's what Jewish prophets did. But Habakkuk was not an ordinary prophet. He didn't speak to the people on behalf of God. Habakkuk spoke to God on behalf of the people because what God was doing did not seem to make sense. And 2,600 years ago, Habakkuk was asking the very same questions that so many people are asking today. There are just 3 chapters in this little book of the Bible. Today we're going to cover the first 12 verses of chapter 1. Let me jump in. Here's what Habakkuk had to say. How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife, conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. By the way, Habakkuk here was describing his own people, the people of Israel. They had drifted far from their commitment to Jehovah God. And Habakkuk is looking at the culture around him, and he sees the corruption and the injustice and the conflict among his own people, and he's really struggling with what he sees. And Habakkuk is asking two questions that we all ask when God makes no sense. The first question is this: how long? How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? God, how much longer are you just going to sit back and allow this to continue? God, you have the power to do something about this, and you're not. When are you going to step in and make things right? How long? His second question that we all like to ask in times like this is why? Why, he says, do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? God, why is this all even happening? You allowed all these things and you don't really seem to care. And I think we all know how he felt, because when we look at the world around us, we sometimes ask those very same questions, don't we? Why, God? How long, God? I mean, we live in a world where children are gunned down in their schools. We live in a world where we have countries with nuclear weapons and unstable leaders. We live in a country where politics has become dysfunctional. A world where evil is increasingly called good and good is increasingly called evil. I mean, this is a messed up world. But sometimes the question we're asking isn't, why is this world so messed up? Maybe for you, the question is, why is my world so messed up? Because it's not just what we see happening around us, it's what is sometimes happening to us. Like when the flood or the fire strikes your home and you lose everything. When someone who is supposed to love you abuses you. When the pregnancy test comes back negative, or when the cancer screen comes back positive. Sometimes it's not just the world out there that's so messed up, it's your little world that's messed up. And in times like that, it can be so easy to look at what's happening and say, God, I don't mean to criticize, but I just don't think you're doing a very good job of running things. It seems like there are so many bad people who are prospering and so many good people who are struggling. It just seems so unfair. God, why? God, how long? And here's something you may be wondering. You may be wondering, Mark, is that okay? Is it okay to question God? Is it okay to push back on God? Is that wrong? Is that like somehow unholy? Is it unfair? Well, here's the truth. Most of the great leaders in Scripture had these moments of wrestling with God and asking hard questions. I'll give you a few examples. Jeremiah. Jeremiah was another Jewish prophet like Habakkuk. He was often described as the weeping prophet because he was so broken about what he saw around him. The book of Jeremiah is, in fact, the longest book in the Bible. Jeremiah had some questions for God. He said, Lord, I want to ask you about some things that don't seem right. Why are wicked people successful? Why do people you cannot trust have such easy lives? You have put these wicked people here like plants with strong roots. They grow and produce fruit. With their mouths they say that you are near and dear to them, but in their hearts they are really far away from you. God, I don't get this. Why? Or David. David was really the greatest king in the history of the nation of Israel. He often had hard questions for God. Like this example in Psalm 13, how long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? In other words, come on, enough already. Moses was leading the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt into the promised land. And let me tell you, the people were not easy to lead. So Moses complains. Moses asked the Lord, and I love this, why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you that you would put the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? Why do you tell me to carry them in my arms as a nurse carries an infant because they're acting like babies to the land you promised on oath to their ancestors? I cannot carry all these people by myself. The burden is too heavy for me. Then he says this, if this is how you're going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me. Like if this is how it's going to be, just put me out of my misery, God. Like even Jesus, when he was being crucified, there was this moment where Jesus was bearing the guilt of the entire world in himself. And in some cosmic way, God turned away from him and away from that sin. And one of the last things Jesus says from the cross is this, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why, God? Why? It's okay to complain. It's okay to wrestle with your feelings and to wrestle with God's silence. In fact, we need to do that because the alternative to wrestling is just walking away. And listen to me, if you're struggling right now, I want you to know that God understands your pain and he welcomes your questions. And I am convinced that God would rather have you yell at him than walk away from him. In fact, the worst thing we can do when God makes no sense is just walk away. Hundreds of years after Habakkuk wrote these words, James, who was the brother of Jesus and the leader of the early church in Jerusalem, he wrote these words in a letter to the Christians. James chapter 1, he says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And he says this, let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. He says, let perseverance finish its work, which implies this. It implies that we can choose to not let perseverance finish its work. The great temptation in times of doubt and difficulty is just to give up and walk away. To walk away from God. To walk away from faith. To walk away from God's people. But something very important happens in our lives when we embrace God, even when we wrestle with our doubts. James says this, let perseverance finish its work so that, here's the result, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. In other words, the promise is this, if we don't bail out when God makes no sense, then we will experience an even greater level of maturity and completeness because we experience our greatest growth in the seasons of struggle, not in the times of comfort. God would much rather have you yell at him than walk away from him. One of the books I've been reading in preparation for this series is a book by Craig Groeschel called Hope in the Dark. It's all about the book of Habakkuk. I love what he writes here. He says, what if honestly acknowledging your doubts is your first step toward building a deeper faith? What if embracing your secret questions opens the door for a maturing knowledge of God's character? What if drawing closer to God, developing genuine intimacy with him, requires you to bear something that feels unbearable? To hear him through an ominous utterance, to trust him in the moment of doom, to embrace his strength when you're weak with a burden. What if it takes real pain to experience deep and abiding hope? So Habakkuk says, God, this doesn't seem fair. Why, God? How long, God? I don't understand. And so eventually, God here responds to Habakkuk. And this is where it gets even more interesting. Are you ready for God's response? I think you're going to be surprised by it, but here's what it is. This is what God says. He says in response to Habakkuk, look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed, for I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe even if you were told. And at this point, Habakkuk is thinking, finally, God, you're going to step in, you're going to set things right, you're going to deal with the suffering and the injustice all around me. You say you're going to do something amazing. This is such good news. Go for it. Do something amazing. But let me keep reading because, again, this is God speaking. He said, I'm raising up the Babylonians. that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are feared and dreaded people, a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swooping to devour. They all come intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. And it goes on like that for another paragraph. It is frightening. God says, listen, Habakkuk, if you think it's bad now, let me give you a heads up. It's about to get worse. Because Habakkuk, I'm going to remove my hand of protection and allow your enemies, the Babylonians, to bring pain and hardship, so that the pain and hardship will perhaps change the hearts of my people. And if Habakkuk was confused before, he's even more confused now. I mean, this makes absolutely no sense to him. God, why would you allow an enemy nation to assault your people? God, why? But the pain that God was about to allow would serve a greater purpose. The purpose of breaking through the hard hearts of his people and restoring them to purity and strength as a nation, rather than allowing his people to keep drifting, rather than letting this nation rot from the inside out and just fall apart. God would allow them to experience some pain. But this pain had a purpose: to call them back and to preserve the nation that would someday produce a Messiah who would be the Savior of the world. But as we'll see in a moment, it made no sense to Habakkuk. When my daughter was just a year old, she developed an infection. It was a serious enough infection that she had to be admitted to the hospital for 3 days. And even though it was 20 years ago, I still remember, like it was yesterday, so clearly standing there holding her down while a nurse inserted a catheter. And then they put a needle in her arm for the IV. And then twice a day while she was in the hospital, they would come and draw a blood sample for testing. She was just a year old. And for a few days, my actions made no sense to her. She may have been thinking, Daddy, why don't you stop these people from hurting me? And I remember wishing that I could somehow communicate with her, somehow explain that what was happening to her was necessary, explain it in terms that she could understand, but I couldn't. And I would never have wanted my daughter to judge my heart toward her based on the events of just those few days. Because the pain that I allowed into her life was actually because of my love for her. It was my love that allowed that pain so that she could recover and grow up and be the beautiful young lady she is today. But what do you do when God's actions or his inaction make no sense? What do you do when you're asking those questions? God, how long? God, why? What do you do when you find yourself there? Well, I believe that you can both wrestle with honest questions and yet embrace a genuine faith in God. You can wrestle with honest questions while embracing a genuine faith in God. You can do both at the same time, and we must. I want you to watch as Habakkuk does this. He tries to embrace God, and yet he doesn't understand what God is doing, and so he's wrestling with his questions. Let me pick up in verse 12. Lord, are you not from everlasting? I'm embracing you, God. I believe in you. My God, my Holy One, you will never die. I'm embracing you. I worship you. But you, Lord, have appointed our enemies to execute judgment. I'm wrestling with this. You, my rock. God, I'm embracing you as my rock. But you have ordained them to punish. I'm wrestling with this, God. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. I'm embracing you. I worship you. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? I'm wrestling with this. Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up these more righteous than themselves? I'm trying to embrace. I'm trying to wrestle. I'm trying to love you, and yet I'm wrestling with these questions. And my friend, when you hit the crisis of belief, don't deny your doubts. Don't run from God. Let your doubts drive you to continue to embrace God even as you wrestle with your questions, because God would rather have you yell at him than walk away from him. Well, that's just the beginning of chapter 1. We'll pick this series up again next week. Looking forward to part 2, but I do want to end today on a note of hope, and maybe every week we'll do this, because eventually Habakkuk gets there. Eventually he rounds the corner and comes to a word of hope, but it's not until the very end of this book. Listen to the closing words of Habakkuk's prophecy. The last 3 verses in this book of the Bible, he says this: though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls. Now, before I go on, you have to remember, this is an agricultural society. What he's describing here is total devastation. No crops, no livestock, nothing. There's hunger, there's starvation. Everything has been taken from them. How would this be written in your life? We live in a different world, but how would this be written in your life? Though I'm divorced, though I have cancer, though I am unemployed, though relationships have disappointed me, though I can't pay my bills, though my relationship with my daughter is still broken. He goes on to say this: Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God, my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to go on the heights. Habakkuk closes out his prophecy by essentially saying, even though I have questions, even though I don't see a solution in sight, and even though God does not make sense, I'm going to lean into him and I'm going to cling to him, even though I can't understand what he's doing. And here's what I've noticed. Whenever suffering invades our lives, the one question we all want to answer is this question: why? Why me? Why them? Why now? Why, God? We all want to answer the why question, and the truth is, you can spend weeks and months and years asking the why question, and you may never know the answer on this side of heaven, and you'll certainly never find peace. But here's what I've discovered. I don't need to know why as long as I know the God who does know why. In fact, let me suggest a much better question to ask whenever suffering invades our lives. The better question is who? Who is God? What is his heart toward me? How deep is his love for me? That's what you really need to know when the bottom falls out of your life. And no matter what the circumstances of your life may be today, if you belong to Christ, here's what you need to go back to. Your past is forgiven, your eternity is secure, and whatever circumstances you may be facing, you don't face them alone. Maybe you've been through a lot of pain, and maybe you're beginning to question God's heart toward you. And that's okay. It's okay to wrestle with questions. But the best way to get past that doubt and the best way to get past questioning God's love for you is to focus on that one undeniable symbol of God's love, because hundreds of years after Habakkuk wrote these words, there was a cross on a hillside just outside the city of Jerusalem. And on that cross hung a man who had healed the sick, fed the hungry, and loved the outcast. A man who was guilty of no crime. A man who was, in fact, the very Son of God. And by the end of that day, his lifeless body was placed in a cold tomb, and a stone was rolled in front of it. Soldiers were put there to guard it. The Roman government put their seal on that stone. And it all seemed so final, so irreversible. It seemed as if death had won. And from a human perspective, this made no sense. God made no sense. That wasn't the end of the story. 3 days later, on Sunday morning, the stone was rolled away, the seal was broken, the soldiers were scattered, death was defeated, and Jesus was alive. And whenever the bottom falls out of your life, when the actions or the inaction of God make no sense, you have to go back and look at the cross. Looking at the cross will not give us the answer to the question, why is this happening to me? But the cross will tell you what the answer isn't, what the answer can't be. It can't be that God doesn't love us. It can't be that he doesn't care, because it was on the cross that God came and plunged himself into a degree of suffering that is far beyond what any of us will ever have to bear in this life. And he did that so that he could rescue us and so that he could eventually bring an end to all suffering. And in our moments of questioning, in our moments of wrestling, we must keep our eyes on the cross, because when you do, it will at least remind you that you have the unconditional love of your Father in heaven. And if I'm fully convinced of his love for me, then I can accept whatever he allows to enter my life. Well, I'm going to wrap up. We'll continue this series, this conversation next week. Right now, the band is going to come and lead us in a powerful song of confession and repentance and dependence.